24 doctors gave up on the Mafia boss, until the Maid's Toddler slept on his chest. The city of Chicago had many kings, but only one ruled without mercy. His name was Damien Voss. 32 years old. 6 feet 2 inches of cold, calculated power. The kind of man who walked into a room and made the air itself go still. His face was sculpted like something out of a dark fairy tale: sharp jaw, steel-gray eyes that never softened, dark hair always perfectly combed back as though even his appearance answered to his authority. He wore custom suits that cost more than most people's mortgages. He drove cars that turned heads on Michigan Avenue. He lived in a mansion on the North Shore that sat behind iron gates and security cameras and men with guns who never slept. People called him the ghost on the streets. Not because he was invisible, but because by the time you knew he had come for you, it was already over. Damien Voss had built his empire from nothing. No father to guide him. No mother who stayed. He grew up in the South Side in a cramped apartment that smelled like cigarettes and broken promises, watching the men on the corner grow powerful while honest men starved. He learned early that the world didn't reward goodness. It rewarded ruthlessness. And so he became ruthless. Brilliantly, terrifyingly ruthless. By 22, he controlled 3 city blocks. By 26, he controlled half the city's underground trade. By 30, the FBI had a file on him thicker than a Bible, and not a single charge that stuck. He was untouchable. He was feared. He was, in every way that the world measures power, invincible. And yet, inside that enormous mansion, behind all those iron gates and armed guards, the hallways were always quiet. Not peaceful quiet. Empty quiet. The kind of silence that settles into a place when no one has laughed there in years. Damien had associates, not friends. He had soldiers, not family. He had women who smiled at him because of what he could give them, not who he was. He had eaten 1,000 expensive dinners alone. He had celebrated 100 victories with men who would have shot him in the back for the right price. He had never once been loved. He told himself he didn't need it. He told himself love was a weakness, a vulnerability, a crack in the armor that enemies exploit. He had seen it destroy men stronger than him. He had watched fathers beg on their knees because someone had taken their children. He had watched men crumble when their wives wept. Love, in Damien Voss's world, was a loaded gun pointed at your own chest. So he kept his chest empty. Locked. Armored. The mansion had a staff of 12. Drivers, cooks, security. And one maid, a young woman named Rosa Mendez, 26 years old, who had come to work for him 18 months ago after being turned away from every other job in the city. She was quiet. Efficient. Invisible in the way that staff in powerful houses learn to be. She moved through the marble hallways with her mop and her cloth, eyes down, quick hands, never speaking unless spoken to. She had a daughter. A tiny, luminous 3-year-old girl named Lily. Lily had her mother's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn little chin, and she laughed like bells and walked like she was always in a hurry to get somewhere wonderful. Rosa brought her sometimes, when there was no babysitter, tucking her into the small staff room downstairs with coloring books and crackers, praying she stayed quiet. Damien Voss had seen the child exactly 4 times in 18 months. He had said nothing to her. He had not smiled at her. He had looked at her the way he looked at most things, with those cold gray eyes, and walked away. And yet, the 3rd time he had seen Lily, Rosa had been crying quietly in the kitchen at midnight. The little girl had a fever of 104. The pharmacy was closed. Rosa had no car. She had no one to call. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her sick baby in her arms, rocking her back and forth, whispering prayers in Spanish because there was nothing else left to do. Damien had come downstairs for water. He had stood in the kitchen doorway for a long moment, looking at them. He had said nothing. But the next morning, there was a paper bag on the kitchen counter. Inside, the exact fever medication, infant drops, the right dosage. And underneath the medicine, a folded piece of paper with a phone number written in sharp, precise handwriting. Below it, 2 words. For emergencies. Rosa had held that piece of paper against her chest and cried in a way she hadn't cried in years. Not because of the medicine. But because she had been seen. By a man everyone said had no heart. That was 18 months ago. Tonight, that man, that feared, invincible, untouchable man, was bleeding out on the floor of his own study. The attack had come fast. Professional. 3 armed men through a window at 11 p.m., when the night security rotation had a 60-second gap. Someone on the inside had known that gap. The shots were precise. The kind of precision that doesn't come from street criminals. This was a hit orchestrated by someone with resources, someone with a grudge deep enough to plan for months. Damien had fought back. Of course he had. Even bleeding, even with a bullet in his side and another in his shoulder, he had taken down 2 of the 3 men before the third escaped into the Chicago night. But when the guards found him 12 minutes later, he was on the floor. Eyes half open. Blood spreading like a dark halo across the white marble. His phone was in his hand. He had been trying to dial. The number on the screen, the last number he had tried to reach in the final conscious moments of his life, was not his head of security. It was not his lawyer. It was not any of the powerful, dangerous men in his contacts. It was Rosa's number. No one understood why. But the ambulance came. And the night tore open. And the city that had feared Damien Voss for 10 years held its breath. Chicago Memorial Hospital had seen everything. Gunshot wounds. Car accidents. Children pulled from fires. Old men who slipped away quietly in the night. Young women who fought with everything they had and still lost. The emergency wing had been built for exactly these moments, the moments when life and death pressed against each other and the only thing standing between them was skill and speed and the desperate, stubborn refusal to let go. But even the most experienced nurses on the night shift went quiet when the ambulance brought Damien Voss in. It wasn't the blood, though there was a great deal of it. It wasn't the gunshots, 2 entry wounds, one perilously close to the heart, one lodged near the spine. It was the look on the paramedics' faces when they wheeled him through the doors. That specific look that emergency workers wear when they already know, when they've known since they loaded the stretcher, but they keep moving anyway because stopping is not something you're allowed to do. Dr. Harrison Webb was the attending physician on call that night. 51 years old. 23 years in trauma surgery. He had operated on senators and gang members and once, memorably, a famous chef who had somehow managed to fall onto his own kitchen knife. He was not a man who rattled easily. He rattled that night. Because by the time Damien Voss reached the operating table, his blood pressure had dropped to the edge of what the human body can survive. His heart had stopped once in the ambulance and been shocked back. The bullet near the spine had caused internal bleeding that was spreading faster than anyone had expected. And the bullet near the heart, the one that had missed by less than half an inch, had done something to the tissue around the left ventricle that showed up on the imaging as a bruise but behaved like a slow collapse. Dr. Webb called in everyone. And everyone came. By midnight, there were 8 surgeons in or around that operating room. By 2 a.m., there were 14. Specialists had been woken from sleep, pulled from other hospitals, driven in from the suburbs. A cardiac surgeon flew in from St. Louis on a private charter, paid for, it would later emerge, by one of Damien's men who made the call the moment he heard the news. 24 doctors, in total, over the course of the next 72 hours. 24 of the finest medical minds in the Midwest. They worked in shifts. They argued in hallways. They consulted in hushed, urgent voices over printouts and scans and lab results that kept getting worse. They tried everything: 3 separate surgeries in 36 hours, experimental blood coagulation therapy, a cardiac procedure so delicate that only 2 doctors in the country had performed it successfully before. Twice, Damien Voss's heart stopped completely. Twice, they brought him back. But each time, he came back a little less. A little quieter. A little farther from the shore. On the 3rd day, the machines were breathing for him. His brain showed activity, faint, flickering, like a candle in a storm, but his body was shutting down in the methodical, inevitable way that bodies do when they have simply taken too much. The internal bleeding had been stopped, but the damage to the tissue around his heart was progressing. Each hour, the numbers on the monitors told the same story: less. Less pressure. Less rhythm. Less life. Rosa was there from the first night. She had heard the commotion at the mansion. She had seen the blood on the marble floor before anyone thought to keep her away from it. And something in her, something that she could not name and did not fully understand, would not let her leave. She had called her neighbor to watch Lily. Then she had followed the ambulance to the hospital. She sat in the waiting area of the ICU floor for 3 days. The guards who knew her from the mansion let her stay. No one from Damien's organization paid much attention to the small, quiet maid in the corner with dark circles under her eyes. They were busy making phone calls, managing the chaos that erupts when a criminal empire suddenly loses its center of gravity. Alliances were shifting. Threats were being made and countered. The whole architecture of power that Damien had built over 10 years was cracking at its edges. No one was thinking about Rosa. On the 2nd day, she went home briefly, changed her clothes, held Lily for 1 long hour, then came back. On the 3rd day, she brought Lily with her. The little girl was in a yellow dress with white daisies on the hem. Rosa had dressed her carefully, as though the brightness of the color mattered somehow, as though cheerfulness could be worn like armor against despair. Lily held her small stuffed rabbit in one arm and held her mother's hand with the other. Her dark eyes were wide and curious as they moved through the hospital hallways. "Mama," she whispered, looking around, "where are all the sick peoples?" "Behind the doors, baby," Rosa whispered back. "We're going to pray for someone." "Who?" Rosa hesitated. How do you explain Damien Voss to a 3-year-old? How do you explain the complicated, contradictory reality of a man who frightened grown men into silence but once left fever medicine on a counter in the middle of the night without saying a word? "A man who was kind to us," she said finally. "Once. A man who helped us when no one else did." Lily considered this with the grave seriousness that only very small children and very old people bring to important things. "Is he sick?" "Yes, baby. Very sick." Lily clutched her rabbit tighter and nodded. "Okay," she said. "I'll be good." That was the morning of the 3rd day. That afternoon, Dr. Webb walked out of the ICU and into the waiting area. He was still in his scrubs. He had not slept in 31 hours and it showed, in the gray beneath his eyes, in the particular slowness of a man who has been fighting too hard for too long and has finally run out of fight. He looked at the cluster of Damien's men first. Delivered the news to them in the clipped, careful language of medicine trying to soften the unsoftenable. "We've done everything possible," he said. "The damage to the cardiac tissue is irreversible at this point. His organs are beginning to fail. We're estimating." He paused. Breathed. "Hours. Not days. The room went very quiet. And in the corner, a 26-year-old woman in a clean shirt with a little girl in a yellow dress pressed her hand over her mouth and tried very hard not to make a sound. She failed. Rosa Mendez had not planned to cry in a hospital waiting room. She had not planned a lot of things in her life. She had not planned to be 23 and pregnant and alone in Chicago when the man she thought loved her disappeared like smoke on a windy day. She had not planned to raise Lily by herself in a studio apartment in Pilsen, counting quarters for bus fare, eating rice and beans 3 nights a week so that her daughter could have the good crackers and the real apple juice. She had not planned to be turned away from 12 jobs in 4 months, too young, too inexperienced, too this, too that, the real reason always hanging unspoken in the air: a single mother is an inconvenience we'd rather not deal with. She had not planned to end up at the iron gate of Damien Voss's North Shore mansion, answering a Craigslist ad for a live-in maid, telling herself she would stay 6 months, just 6 months, just long enough to save enough to breathe again. That was 18 months ago. And now she was sitting in a hospital, being told that the man she worked for, the man the whole city feared, the man whose name made other powerful men lower their voices, was dying. Was already, in every practical sense, gone. She sat with Lily in her lap and let herself cry for exactly 5 minutes. She counted. She always counted. She had learned early that grief, like everything else in her life, had to be rationed. You could not afford to fall apart completely when you were someone's whole world. Lily needed her steady. Lily needed her functional. So Rosa allowed herself 5 minutes, real, honest, shaking tears, and then she pressed her palms flat against her thighs, took 4 slow breaths, and looked down at her daughter. Lily was looking up at her with those enormous dark eyes. "Mama sad," she said softly. "A little, baby." "Because of the man?" "Yes." Lily reached up with one small hand and patted Rosa's cheek. Gently. Repeatedly. The way toddlers comfort, earnest and slightly too firm and absolutely, devastatingly sincere. Rosa caught Lily's little hand and held it against her face and closed her eyes. She thought about the medicine on the counter. She thought about the night she had arrived at the mansion for her interview, nervous, underdressed, clutching Lily on her hip because she'd had nowhere to leave her. She remembered the way the head of staff, a severe woman named Mrs. Holt, had looked at the baby and opened her mouth to say something that would have ended the interview before it started. And she remembered the way Damien Voss had appeared at the top of the staircase at exactly that moment. She still didn't know if it was coincidence or intention, and looked down at Rosa and Lily with those unreadable gray eyes, and then said, without inflection, without warmth, without anything, "Hire her. Give her the East Wing room." And walked away. Mrs. Holt's mouth had closed. Rosa had gotten the job. She thought about the afternoon, 8 months ago, when 2 of Damien's men, younger, meaner, the kind of men who hadn't yet learned how to be careful with their power, had cornered Rosa in the laundry room and said things to her that made the walls feel very small and the air feel very thin. She had been trembling when she got back to her room. She had sat on her bed and held Lily and tried to convince herself it was fine, it was nothing, she needed this job, she couldn't afford to make a complaint. The next morning, both men were gone. Not transferred. Gone. Their rooms cleared out, their cars missing from the garage. No explanation was ever given. But that same morning, Damien had passed her in the hallway on his way to a meeting. He hadn't looked at her. Hadn't said a word. But he had slowed, just barely, just for a fraction of a second, and placed a folded $50 bill on the hallway table beside her cart as he passed. It was not an apology. Damien Voss would never apologize. She understood that. But it was something. And then there was the Christmas morning, 6 months ago. Rosa had not expected anything. She was staff. She was the maid. She had bought Lily a second-hand doll from the thrift store on Milwaukee Avenue and wrapped it in tissue paper and tied it with a ribbon she saved from a grocery bag, and she had told herself it was enough, it was plenty. Lily was 3 and 3-year-olds don't know the difference. But on Christmas morning, there was a box outside her door. Inside, a beautiful baby doll with a complete wardrobe of tiny clothes. A storybook. A set of crayons so large and comprehensive that Lily had literally gasped and put both hands over her mouth when she opened them. And at the bottom of the box, tucked under the tissue paper, a small envelope with a gift card to the children's bookstore on Clark Street. Enough to buy 40 books. There was no card. No name. No explanation. But Rosa had known. She had known because no one else in that house would have. No one else in that house even registered that she had a daughter. To Damien's world, Rosa and Lily were furniture, present, necessary, invisible. Except, apparently, to Damien. In his cold, wordless, armored way. She thought about all of this now, sitting in the hospital waiting room while the men in expensive suits made phone calls and the doctors moved in and out with faces that said everything they weren't allowed to say. She thought about the contradiction of this man, the violence and the medicine, the fear and the $50 bill, the cruelty of his world and the quiet, inexplicable gentleness that surfaced sometimes in the dark, when no one important was watching. She thought about how no one in that waiting room was crying. Not one of his men. Not one of his associates. The people who had served him, feared him, profited from him, they were worried, yes. But worried the way people get worried when a business is failing. Worried about what comes next, about their own positions, about the shifting of power. Not one of them was sitting in a corner with their hand pressed over their mouth and tears running silently down their face because the thought of this man not existing in the world anymore felt like a specific, personal grief. Only Rosa. Only the maid. She looked at the door to the ICU hallway. She thought about Dr. Webb's words. Hours. Not days. She thought about Damien Voss dying alone in there. Surrounded by machines and tubes and the sterile indifference of medical equipment. No one holding his hand. No one speaking to him. Just the slow, mechanical countdown of monitors recording the retreat of a life. Something moved inside her chest. Something that wasn't logic and wasn't reason and wasn't anything she could have defended in a conversation with a sensible person. She looked down at Lily. Lily was looking at the ICU door too, with that focused, unblinking attention that small children give to things that interest them. "Mama," she said, in her small, clear voice, "can we go see him?" Rosa stared at her daughter. "The man," Lily added, as though clarification were needed. "The sick man. Can we go pray by him? Like you said?" Rosa's throat tightened. She looked at the door again. She thought about every sensible reason not to go through it. The guards. The rules. The absurdity of a maid walking into an ICU room where the world's most feared criminal lay dying to what? Pray? Offer comfort? What comfort could she possibly give to a man like that? But then she thought, who else will? Who else is going to walk through that door? Who else is going to make sure he doesn't die completely alone? She stood up. She picked up Lily. And she walked toward the door. The ICU hallway smelled like antiseptic and recycled air. The fluorescent lights overhead had that particular quality of hospital lighting, too bright, too even, the kind of light that leaves no shadows and therefore no mercy. Every surface was white or gray. Every sound was muffled and purposeful. There was no warmth in this hallway. It had been designed for efficiency, not comfort, because the people who built it understood that what happened here was beyond the reach of comfort. Rosa walked with Lily on her hip. She passed the nurse's station. A nurse looked up, young, tired, the particular look of someone on hour 11 of a 12-hour shift, and started to say something. Then she looked at Lily in the yellow daisy dress clutching her stuffed rabbit, and something shifted in her face, and she looked back down at her screen instead. No one stopped them. At the end of the hallway, room 14. The door had a small window. Rosa looked through it before opening it. She had expected, she didn't know what she had expected. Something dramatic, maybe. Something that looked like the movies, like a clear narrative of struggle and resistance. What she saw was stillness. Damien Voss lay in the hospital bed surrounded by a constellation of machines. There were tubes in his arms, tubes in his throat, wires attached to his chest that fed data to 3 separate monitors. The ventilator breathed for him in a steady, mechanical rhythm, push, pause, release, a sound both deeply unnatural and strangely like a lullaby. His face, always so sharp and commanding in life, had gone slack. The color had drained from it until he looked like a marble sculpture of himself, the same strong jaw, the same defined features, but emptied of the current that had always made him terrifying. He looked, Rosa thought, desperately young. 32 years old. She kept forgetting how young he was. Power ages a person's reputation far faster than it ages their face. Lying there without his authority, without his suit, without the invisible force field of danger that always surrounded him, he looked like someone's son. Someone's brother. Someone who had never, not once, been taken care of. "Mama," Lily whispered. "He's sleeping." "Yes, baby. Is he gonna be okay?" Rosa pushed open the door. The room was even quieter than the hallway. The ventilator kept its rhythm. The monitors kept their quiet, sparse beeping, not the urgent rapid beeping of crisis, but the slow, widely spaced tone of a heart doing the bare minimum, making no promises. Rosa carried Lily to the chair beside the bed and sat down. She looked at Damien's face for a long moment. She thought about praying. She was a woman of faith, the practical, worn smooth kind of faith that poor people develop, the kind that isn't fancy but doesn't break. She prayed on the bus. She prayed over Lily's head at night when she thought her daughter was sleeping. She had prayed in that kitchen at midnight with the sick baby in her arms. She prayed now, silently, her lips barely moving. Lily was very still on her lap, which was unusual. Lily was never still. Lily was a person in permanent motion, a small body in constant negotiation with gravity and boredom. But now she sat quietly and looked at the man in the bed with an expression of serious, undivided attention that Rosa had rarely seen on her daughter's face. 3-year-olds don't fully understand death. They understand sleep. They understand quiet. They understand the sense that something important is happening, even if the parameters of that importance are beyond them. Lily understood something was important. She watched Damien's chest, the slow, mechanical rise and fall, the ventilators work, with her head slightly tilted, like she was listening to music from a great distance. Minutes passed. The monitors beeped their sparse, discouraging rhythm. Rosa prayed. She held Lily. She tried to find words for what she was asking God for but kept arriving at the same simple, inelegant request: please don't let him die alone. Please let someone who actually sees him be here when he goes, if he has to go. Please let the last thing near his heart be something that means it. She wasn't sure that was a proper prayer. She said it anyway. And then Lily did something. Rosa would spend years afterwards trying to explain this moment, to herself, to the few people she eventually told, to the quiet space of her own memory. She would never fully be able to explain it, because the explanation that made the most sense was also the one that sounded the least rational. Lily simply leaned forward. She looked at the man in the bed the way she looked at her stuffed rabbit when it fell on the floor, with a matter-of-fact tenderness, an unthinking instinct to restore comfort to something that had lost it. "Down, Mama," she said quietly. "What, baby?" "Down." She was already leaning toward the bed, her small arms reaching. "Want down?" "Lily, no, we can't." "Down, Mama. Please." The please, always the please, they had worked so hard on the please, soft and earnest and completely certain. Rosa looked at the bed. At the machines. At the motionless man. She thought about all the reasons this was impossible, inappropriate, medically insane. Then she looked at her daughter's face. There was no mischief in it. No toddler obstinacy. Just that strange, calm certainty. Rosa stood. She lowered Lily carefully toward the edge of the bed, keeping her own hands under her arms, ready to pull her back. Lily reached out and touched the blanket first. Then, with a confidence that had no right to exist in a 3-year-old entering an ICU room, she climbed, carefully, gently, with the precise carefulness of a child who has been told many times to be gentle with fragile things, onto the bed. She positioned herself on Damien's chest. Not beside him. Not near him. On him. Her small body curled against the broad plane of his chest, her cheek resting directly over his heart. Her stuffed rabbit was tucked under her chin. Her eyes drifted closed. She looked, Rosa would later say, like she had done this 1,000 times. Like this was a specific, familiar, beloved place she had simply been away from for a while and was now returning to. The room went very, very still. Rosa stood frozen, hands half extended, unable to breathe. She was aware that she should move Lily. She was aware that every medical protocol in existence said she should pick her daughter up and take her out of this room and apologize to whatever nurse eventually came by. She stood frozen. The ventilator breathed. The monitors kept their slow, bleak rhythm. Seconds passed. Then a minute. Then 2. Rosa was watching the cardiac monitor, that single green line doing its minimal, exhausted work, the spaces between beeps growing longer in a way that Dr. Webb had explained meant the heart was beginning to let go. She watched the line. She held her breath. And then. The line changed. Not dramatically. Not like the movies where the flat line suddenly explodes into normal rhythm. Just a shift. The spaces between the beeps became slightly shorter. The peaks on the monitor became slightly taller. A tiny, inexplicable increase in a number that had been declining for 72 hours. Rosa blinked. She looked at the monitor again. The number was still going up. The cardiac monitor in room 14 began alarming at 4:47 in the afternoon. Not the flatline alarm. Not the critical decline alarm. A different alarm. One that the nurses at the station had not heard from that room in 3 days. The rhythm alarm, the one that triggers when a heart, against all expectation, begins to beat on its own. The nurse who responded first was a woman named Carol, 20 years in critical care, the kind of nurse who has seen enough to be unsentimental about most things. She pushed open the door to room 14 already prepared for what she assumed was a monitoring glitch, an equipment error, one of those cruel false alarms that exhausted minds learn to brace for. She stopped in the doorway. She stood there for a full 3 seconds, which, in the measured economy of ICU nursing, is an eternity, before her brain processed what her eyes were seeing. A small child in a yellow dress, curled on the chest of a man who had been dying, fast asleep, her cheek over his heart, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin. And the monitor showing, impossible, undeniable, a cardiac rhythm that had strengthened by 30% in 7 minutes. Carol turned to the hallway and said, in a voice that was carefully, professionally neutral, I need Dr. Webb in room 14. Now. Dr. Harrison Webb arrived 90 seconds later. He looked at the monitor first, reflexively, automatically, his eyes going to numbers before faces. He saw the rhythm. He saw the pressure. He saw the oxygen saturation, which had moved from 82%, the borderline number that had haunted them for 2 days, to 91% in less than 10 minutes. Then he turned and looked at the source. He stood in silence for a moment that Rosa, standing against the wall with her hands clasped under her chin, would later describe as feeling like the whole world taking a breath. "Who?" he started. "She's mine," Rosa said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My daughter. I'm sorry. I'll take her, Don't." Dr. Webb's voice was strange. Not commanding, not clinical. Strange in the way of a person who is confronting something that doesn't fit in any of the categories his training provided for. "Don't move her." He looked at the monitor again. He looked at the child again. He pressed his stethoscope to his own ears and leaned, carefully, slowly, so as not to disturb the sleeping child, and listened to Damien Voss's heart. He straightened up. He looked at Carol. Carol looked at him. They had worked together for 11 years. They had a whole language built of glances and they used it now, a rapid, wordless exchange of disbelief, of professional caution battling against the evidence of their own instruments. "Get me Webb and Patel and Kim," Dr. Webb said finally, his voice still carrying that quality of careful, deliberate composure. "All of them." Within 20 minutes, the hallway outside room 14 was populated with 6 of the 24 doctors who had worked on Damien Voss over the previous 3 days. They cycled in and out in pairs, reading monitors, reviewing numbers, speaking to each other in the hushed, rapid vocabulary of people who need to make sense of something quickly. Rosa stood against the wall the entire time. She watched them watch her daughter sleep on the chest of a dying man who was, with every passing minute, becoming slightly less dying. The cardiac pressure, rising. The oxygen saturation, holding at 94%. The heart rhythm, no longer the sparse, reluctant stutter of an organ preparing to quit, but something more sustained. More intentional. Dr. Patel, cardiac specialist, the one who had been flown in from St. Louis, stood at the foot of the bed for a very long time. He was a man of precise, quantitative intelligence, the kind of doctor who believed deeply in the sufficiency of biological explanation. He had 3 published papers on cardiac tissue recovery. He had a particular contempt, professionally, for what he called anecdote medicine, the tendency to attribute recovery to factors that couldn't be measured. He stood at the foot of the bed and he looked at Lily sleeping on Damien's chest and he was completely, perfectly quiet for 90 seconds. Then he said, to no one in particular, skin-to-skin contact increases oxytocin production. Oxytocin has measurable effects on cardiac rhythm and vascular relaxation. A pause. That's the biological mechanism. Carol looked at him. Sure, she said. Another pause. But that, he said, his voice doing something that was almost, not quite, a softening, doesn't explain the rate of change. He turned and walked out. Rosa was watching Lily. Lily had not moved. Had not stirred. She lay with the absolute trust of a sleeping child, the complete surrender to safety, to warmth, to the certainty that she was held. Her small chest rose and fell in a rhythm that seemed, to Rosa, to be the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. And beneath her, beneath that small, warm, completely innocent body, Damien Voss's chest rose and fell in the same rhythm. As though his body, which had forgotten how to do this on its own, was following her lead. As though something in him, something below language, below consciousness, below all the years of armor and isolation and deliberate emptiness, recognized the weight of a child who trusted him completely. Recognized it as something worth staying for. Rosa pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. She was not going to cry. She was not. She was absolutely crying. She cried silently, the way she had learned to cry so as not to wake Lily, the way she had cried in bathrooms and stairwells and once, memorably, in a grocery store parking lot at 10 p.m. when the cumulative weight of everything had finally tipped over. Silent tears that rolled down her face and fell onto her shirt and meant everything she had no words for. At 6:15 p.m., Dr. Webb made a decision. He began the process of reducing the ventilator support. This was not a small thing. This was the test, the real test, the one that would tell them whether what they were seeing on the monitors was sustainable or illusory. Reducing ventilator support means asking the patient's own respiratory system to take over. In a patient as compromised as Damien Voss, this was the equivalent of removing the training wheels from a bicycle that had never actually learned to ride. They reduced support by 20%. The monitors held. They waited 15 minutes. They reduced by another 20%. The monitors held. Dr. Webb looked at Carol. Carol looked at Dr. Webb. Lily slept on. At 7:02 p.m., 2 hours and 15 minutes after a 3-year-old in a yellow daisy dress had climbed onto the chest of a man who was hours from death, Damien Voss began to breathe on his own. The ventilator was breathing with him now, not for him. The distinction was everything. Dr. Webb walked out of room 14 and into the hallway and stood with his back against the wall for a moment with his eyes closed. Around him, the ICU continued its constant professional motion, nurses moving, carts rolling, other patients, other crises. He opened his eyes. He looked at the ceiling. He was not, by any definition, a spiritual man. He believed in data and intervention and the remarkable, non-miraculous machinery of trained human bodies doing trained human work. He stood in that hallway and he could not find a single data point that explained what was happening in room 14. He went back in. He sat in the second chair, the one across from Rosa, the one the nurses used when they were charting, and he looked at the sleeping child and the man who was breathing and he said, very quietly, "I've been doing this for 23 years. Rosa looked at him. "I don't have a word for this," he said. Rosa nodded. She understood. Some things arrive in the world without the courtesy of a word. Some things simply are. They sat in silence. The monitor beeped its new, steadier rhythm. Lily slept on. He came back slowly. Not all at once. Not in the dramatic, gasping, sudden way of movies. Real returns from the edge are slower than that, more tentative, more questioning, as though the self is re-entering a body it's not entirely sure it wants to be back in. Consciousness reassembles itself in pieces, awareness of warmth first, then sound, then the faint, distant signals of a body making itself known. Damien Voss's first coherent sensation was weight. Something warm and real and specific pressing against his chest. Not the weight of tubes. Not the weight of machinery. Not the flat, impersonal pressure of a hospital bed. Something alive. Something that breathed. His mind, foggy and slow and working through layers of sedation and damage and time, could not immediately make sense of it. He lay in the dark behind his closed eyes and felt this warmth, and his mind, which had been running on pure survival instinct for 3 days, which had been doing nothing but the most basic, desperate biological maintenance, his mind was confused by it. Confused by how good it felt. Confused by the way the warmth seemed to mean something, seemed to carry information he didn't have a category for. He was aware, dimly, of the sound of machines. He was aware of a smell, antiseptic and something else, something warmer, something like a child. He was aware of a slight sound, regular and soft, that it took him a long time to identify. Breathing. Someone else's breathing, right on his chest, close enough that he could feel it. He tried to open his eyes. It took a long time. His eyelids had the quality of things that have been still too long, heavy, reluctant, insisting on more time. He rested. He tried again. The first thing he saw was the ceiling. White. Fluorescent. Hospital. He blinked. The light made him wince. He turned his head, very slowly, his neck a map of discomfort, everything a map of discomfort, to the left. He saw the monitor. Saw the green line doing its steadier work. Saw numbers that meant nothing to him but which, somewhere in the processed information of his fading consciousness, he understood to be better than they had been. He turned his head to the right. He saw Rosa. She was asleep in the chair, her body folded in that impractical way that people sleep in hospital chairs, her head tipped back, one hand on the armrest, the other resting flat on her knee. Her face in sleep had let go of the control she maintained while awake. She looked tired in the deep, whole-body way that caring for someone costs. There were dried tear tracks on her cheeks. Her hair had escaped whatever it had been tied in and was falling forward. He looked at her for a moment. He tried to understand why she was here. He looked down at his chest. He found the warmth. A child. A small girl in a yellow dress, sleeping on his chest with her cheek pressed directly over his heart and a stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin. He couldn't see her face from this angle, only the dark hair, only the small curve of her ear, only the fragile ladder of her tiny spine rising and falling with each breath. He stared. His brain, which had spent 32 years processing threat and strategy and dominance and survival, had no file for this. No framework. No prepared response. It could assess a rival's weaknesses in 30 seconds. It could read a room for danger with an accuracy that had kept him alive for a decade. It had no mechanism for processing the sight of a sleeping child who had climbed onto his chest and, apparently, decided to stay. Something happened in his face. It was small. Barely visible. The kind of movement that only the most attentive watching would catch. A single moment in which all of the careful architecture of his expression, the impassivity, the control, the absolute refusal to display anything that could be read as vulnerability, simply slipped. Not for long. A second, maybe two. But in that second, something raw and old and genuinely young moved across the face of Damien Voss. Something that looked, in the clinical light of the ICU, startlingly like grief. The grief not of a man who has lost something, but of a man who is only now, for the first time, understanding what he has never had. His throat moved. His hand, the one not attached to the 4-line, lifted very slowly from the bed. He moved it with the careful, unpracticed tentativeness of someone attempting a thing they have never done. He lowered it toward the small child on his chest. His large hand hovered for a moment. Then, very gently, he placed it on Lily's back. His whole hand covered almost the entirety of her small back. He could feel her ribs. He could feel the tiny machinery of her breathing. He could feel the specific warmth of a child, that particular, almost impossible warmth that children have, the warmth that seems to come not just from temperature but from something more essential. He held his hand there. He didn't move. Lily, in her sleep, made a small sound. A contented sound. She shifted slightly, burrowing a fraction closer, and her little fist closed around the fabric of his hospital gown. Damien Voss, who had not cried since he was 7 years old and decided that crying was a luxury he couldn't afford, who had trained himself out of it so thoroughly that he had come to believe he was simply not constructed for it, felt his eyes fill. He didn't let the tears fall. He was 32 years old and his whole life had been an argument against this, and the argument didn't stop just because he was in an ICU with a child on his chest. But they were there, those tears, standing at the edge of his eyes like people waiting at a closed door, insisting that this mattered, that something in this room was worth the water. Across from him, Rosa's eyes opened. She woke the way mothers of young children wake, instantly, fully, already scanning for Lily before her vision had fully cleared. She found Lily first. Then she found Damien. His gray eyes. Open. Looking at her. She went completely still. For a moment, a long, strange, impossibly heavy moment, they simply looked at each other. The maid and the Mafia boss. The woman who had seen him in the dark hallways and the quiet kitchens, who had cleaned his empty rooms and found his lonely discarded dinner plates, who had understood for 18 months that the fearsome man who owned this kingdom was the loneliest person in it. And the man who had spent 10 years being looked at with fear and deference and calculation, and who was now being looked at by someone who had, apparently, decided his life was worth fighting for even when everyone else had stopped. Rosa's mouth opened. "You're awake," she whispered. Her voice was destroyed, rough from crying and exhaustion and the kind of emotional expenditure that doesn't have a name but leaves you wrecked. "You're awake. Oh God. You're..." She pressed both hands over her mouth. Damien looked at her. Then he looked down at the child on his chest. Then he looked back at Rosa. When he spoke, his voice was barely there, a torn, unused thing, the voice of a man who has not spoken in days and would not have recognized its own roughness even if he had. But the words were clear. "She came," he said. "Why did she come?" Rosa lowered her hands from her mouth. Her chin was trembling. "Because," she started. Stopped. Tried again. "Because you were kind to us. Once. And I didn't want you to be alone." Damien looked at her for a long time. Something in his face shifted again, that same small, almost invisible movement, the armor showing its age. "I've never had that before," he said. Rosa didn't ask what he meant. She knew. They extubated him on the 4th morning. The medical team was cautious, appropriately, professionally cautious, and spoke in qualified language about remarkable progress and monitoring for complications and not making premature conclusions. Dr. Webb used the word unprecedented exactly once, in a hushed hallway conversation with Dr. Patel, and then seemed to make a conscious decision to retire it. Unprecedented didn't fit cleanly into discharge papers or insurance documentation. But unprecedented was what it was, and everyone in that ICU knew it. Damien Voss spent 11 days in Chicago Memorial. Rosa and Lily came every day. Not because anyone asked them to. Not because it was part of Rosa's employment or her obligation or any arrangement that existed on paper anywhere. They came because Lily asked to go see the man every morning with the persistent, non-negotiable certainty of a 3-year-old who has decided something matters. And because Rosa, who had spent 18 months being invisible in the house of a powerful man, had discovered, in the most unexpected possible way, that she was not invisible to him at all. The first real conversation happened on the 3rd day of his wakefulness, when the tubes were mostly gone and the pain medication had been reduced enough that he could hold a thought for longer than a minute. Rosa had brought Lily, and Lily had immediately climbed onto the visitor chair and demanded to show Damien her rabbit, whose name was, she explained gravely, Mr. Hop. Damien Voss, who had negotiated with police commissioners and cartel representatives and corrupt senators, listened to a 3-year-old explain the full biography of Mr. Hop, including his favorite color, yellow, his best friend, a sock monkey named Gerald who was at home, and his dietary preferences, crackers, specifically the fish-shaped ones, with an expression of such complete and unguarded attention that Rosa had to look away. Because it was too much. Because watching a man who had forgotten how to be human remember, in real time, in front of her, in the space of a small child's chatter about a stuffed rabbit, was almost more than she could hold. On the seventh day, when Lily had fallen asleep in the chair and Rosa and Damien sat in the particular quiet of a room with a sleeping child, he told her something. He didn't look at her when he said it. He looked at the window, at the gray Chicago afternoon pressing against the glass. "I've been afraid my whole life," he said. Rosa waited. "I thought fear was something I gave other people. Something I used." A pause. "I didn't understand it was what I lived inside. Every decision I made, the empire, the power, all of it, was about never being afraid again. Never being small again. Never being the kid from the South Side who had nothing and no one." He was quiet for a moment. "I thought if I became terrifying enough, the fear would stop." "Did it?" Rosa asked. He turned to look at her. "No," he said. She nodded. "But," he stopped. "Started again. When I woke up. With her on my chest." He glanced at Lily. "I wasn't afraid. For the first time in I don't know how long. I was just." He searched for the word. "Here. I was just here." Rosa looked at her daughter sleeping in the chair, one arm flopped over the side, mouth slightly open, Mr. Hop clutched to her chest. "She does that," Rosa said softly. "She makes you just be here." "How do you do it?" he asked. "How do you raise someone like that?" "Like what?" "Like she has no idea the world is dangerous." He was watching Lily with an expression that had completely let go of itself. "Like she trusts everything. Like she doesn't know it can hurt." Rosa thought about this for a moment. "She knows," she said. "She's gotten sick. She's been scared. She's had hard nights." She paused. "But she also knows I'll be there. So the fear doesn't win. That's the difference." She looked at Damien. "The fear doesn't win when someone is there." He was quiet for a long time. Then, "I'm sorry. About the men. In the laundry room." Rosa blinked. "You knew about that?" "I know everything that happens in my house." His jaw tightened. "It shouldn't have happened. I dealt with it." A pause. "I should have dealt with it faster. And I should have told you. That you were safe. Directly. Instead of," he made a gesture she understood to mean the envelope, the money, the cold, indirect language of a man who doesn't know how to simply say a thing. "I understood," she said. "You shouldn't have had to understand." He looked at her steadily. "You should have just been told." The apology was not extravagant. It was not decorated. It was delivered in the same direct, unembellished way he did everything, but it was real. It was a real apology from a man who had probably given very few real ones in his life, and Rosa understood the weight of it, understood what it cost him to dismantle even this small part of the fortress. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. They sat in the quiet with the sleeping child between them. This is the part that people always want to know, the part that gets asked about, in the weeks and months that follow. What happened after? Did he change? Did he leave that life? Was it a permanent transformation? The answer is, life is not a movie. Life is slower and more complicated and less tidy than the movies know how to show. Transformation, real transformation, does not happen in a single moment. It happens in the accumulation of small, deliberate choices made in the direction of a person you are trying to become. What is true is this. Damien Voss left Chicago Memorial Hospital 11 days after being brought in through its emergency doors in a state that 24 doctors had, one by one, given up on. He walked out, slowly, carefully, with a cane he hated and a recovery plan he followed with the same disciplined intensity he had applied to every other endeavor in his life. He was alive. He was, by any reasonable medical assessment, inexplicably, stubbornly, miraculously alive. What is true is that Rosa kept her job, and Lily kept coming to the mansion, but things were different now. There were meals eaten at a table together. There were books read aloud, Damien reading to Lily in his low, rough voice, holding the picture books with a care that made Rosa's heart do something she couldn't name. There were conversations in the kitchen that lasted longer than the task required. There was a slowness to things that had not been there before, a willingness to not rush out of the room, to not disappear behind a closed door, to be, simply, present. What is true is that Lily called him D, she could not manage Damien, and that the first time she said it, he stopped walking mid-stride and stood very still for a moment before turning around to look at her, and that the expression on his face at that moment was one that Rosa would carry with her for the rest of her life. What is true is that a man who had organized his entire existence around the principle that love was a vulnerability discovered, in the most humbling way imaginable, that he had been wrong. That love is not what breaks you open. It is what finds you already broken and decides you are worth staying beside. What is true is that a 3-year-old girl in a yellow daisy dress walked into an ICU room where medicine had given up and science had stepped back, and she climbed onto the chest of a dying man because she was 3 years old, and 3-year-olds do not yet know that some people are supposed to be beyond saving. She did not know his history. She did not know his sins. She did not know the blood and the fear and the empire built on broken things. She knew only that he was cold and she was warm. And that seemed, to her, like enough reason. Maybe it is the truest thing in the world, that love, at its most essential, is exactly this simple. Not earned and not deserved and not contingent on anything. Just warmth offered to something cold. Just presence offered to something alone. 24 doctors had done everything science could do. And a child did the one thing science can't. She laid her heart on top of his and let the warmth do its work. And Damien Voss, who had been feared by thousands and loved by no one, opened his eyes to a small face peering at him with cheerful, uncomplicated acceptance, and understood, in the most foundational, unguarded moment of his 32 years, that this was what he had been surviving toward. Not the empire. Not the power. Not the fear. This. Just this. A child who did not know he was supposed to be terrible. A woman who had seen him clearly and stayed anyway. A room full of quiet. A heart, his heart, the one medicine had surrendered on, beating. Still beating.